today, Ambassador Michael Battle heads the United States mission to the African Union. He is the third ambassador to be appointed to that position since his government created the mission in 2006. Well, is he making a difference? Welcome to the program, Ambassador Battle.
It's an honor to be here with you.
When the Bush administration nominated your predecessor, in 2000, Carville in 2006, it was very important for the United States to focus on Africa. It kind of decided not to rely on the ambassadors that you have spread out in Africa.
Well, the substantive difference in 2006 when President Bush decided to open up USAU was that the U.S. government was making a shift from an absolute dependency on bilateral diplomacy to an effort to accent multilateral diplomacy as a complement to bilateral diplomacy. So it had nothing to do with not being able to depend on our bilateral ambassadors, which we have more bilateral ambassadors on the African continent than any other nation. But what we wanted to do was to recognize that the African Union was a regional continental organization that had the responsibility to try to speak for the continent with one voice. And we wanted to be present to try to impact the development of that voice and to be supportive of strengthening the capacity of the African Union to in fact speak as one voice for the continent. So it was a recognition of the value of multilateral diplomacy, the value of the African Union and its role with the United Nations, and the value of the regional economic communities that make up the African continent.
But the ambassadors in African countries are grounded very well to be able to influence respective African governments. Why is it necessary for you to have one here?
They're grounded very well to influence bilateral relationships. When you influence the African Union as a whole, you're able to influence a multilateral organization that has dynamics that affect the entire continent. For example, we have an ambassador in Geneva that works with all the UN organizations in Geneva. We have a UN ambassador in Rome. We also have a bilateral ambassador in Rome. We also have an ambassador in Rome who's assigned to the Vatican. The ambassadors who have bilateral responsibilities are limited to the boundaries of that nation. We have an ambassador here in Ethiopia who deals with Ethiopian issues. When you work with the African Union, you're not only affecting individual bilateral nations, you are affecting the continent. I'll give you a good example. The continent in the Commission of Political Affairs is trying to implement a charter on good governance that will affect the entire continent. Once 15 nations on the African continent embrace the charter, and there are 10 who have already done so to date, once an additional 5, it becomes continental policy, not just bilateral national policy. So we want to shape all of the regional organizations on the earth. The African Union, we have an ambassador to the Organization of American States, and of course we are a part of that. We have an ambassador who's assigned to work with the East Asian countries as well. So we are focusing on multilateral and bilateral diplomacy, and that's why USAU is here.
You earlier said one voice, speaking in one voice, you mean as Africans,
right.
But it seems that you are adding your voice into what could have essentially been an African and ultimately a unique voice.
Well, we are certainly...
In other words, that's an influence.
Well, absolutely. All diplomacy is a factor of influence, shaping direction, and assisting in the process. When you look at the African Union voice, it is ultimately an African voice, African solutions for African problems. As President Obama has said, that the future of the African continent is ultimately in the hands of Africans. But we certainly have resources. We certainly have capacity to assist the African continent in the development of continental policy. Give you a good example. The African Union is looking now at the development of a maritime strategy that will not only deal with issues of piracy, but will deal with issues of the oil that is being transported off the coast of Africa, deal with fishery rights and protection in the whole 9 yards. Well, no nation on the African continent has a strong enough navy or strong enough coast guard to be able to manage to patrol the entire continent. But with U.S. support, with Danish support, with other nations' support, we can certainly help the African Union in developing a maritime strategy. We have the resources to do that. We have the facilities to do that. And in that way, it is influence.
Are you a welcome guest in Africa?
I think I'm exceedingly welcome in Africa. I've traveled in a number of places on the continent.
I'm talking about as a U.S. government representative in the African Union.
Oh, absolutely. I'm a welcome guest. And the African Union is a welcome guest at the U.S. In fact, in the last 2 years, I started this in 2010, after being here for 1 year. We have had high-level conversations between the African Union and the U.S. In Washington, D.C., and hopefully we will do the third high-level conversation with the African Union in 2012. And it is not only the U.S. that has high-level conversations with the African Union. The Japanese are doing the same, the Chinese are doing the same, Turkey, any nation throughout the world that looks at the future development of the world recognizes that it is clearly the case that the African continent has more member states in the United Nations than any other continent. The African continent at this point probably has the largest youth bulge than any other nation on the continent. More young people, which means that the future of the world is going to be very much shaped by the development of this continent. And we definitely will be a player in the process of the development of the continent as a support agency to the development of the continent, not as a definer of the development, but as a support agency to that development.
But basically you are defining that course for Africa because you are very critical to Chinese influence in Africa. Are you not? You've said that quite often.
Okay. Let's go back to your original statement, which I want to take issue with. We do not define the course of Africa's future. We support the process of the African continent developing its understanding of its future.
But that's what your secretaries of state have done in the past. Condi Rice have done that, Hillary Clinton has done that. They're trying to set the agenda for Africa.
Not trying to set the agenda for Africa. There's a terminology change that is more substantial than terminology. It's also a philosophical difference between setting the course for the African continent and working with the African continent in building capacity so the African continent sets its own course. We do not define for the African continent its direction. We do not dictate to the African continent its direction. We support the African continent. In fact, if you were to dialogue with people at the African Union that we have been of assistance to, like the development of its Resource Center for Communications, every time we purchase anything, it is precisely what they have asked for, the brand that they asked for. Even when we support the development of the library at the African Union, we only buy titles of books that they request. We do not dictate, we do not define, but we certainly do support, and we will be a continual, strong supporter of the African continent because there's a mutual strategic advantage to the U.S. and to the African continent. Now, reference your question on China.
Yeah, this is what I'm heading up. I mean, here's what it is. The reason why I'm saying that you're trying to define the course Africa should take is this, because you come with your set of priorities, don't you? Because, for example, on the other side of the plane, the flip side to it is the Chinese say, hey, what do you want to do? Yes, we are here to be partners in development. We are going to make money out of several projects that you're going to handle in Africa, from mines to you name it, and they are there, they're joining hands and making a difference. This is what most Africans are saying. But when the yes comes into the picture, it comes from a very different perspective. Yes. That is, you know, if you're going to do this, you have to be able to do this. It's kind of prescription.
Okay, now let's talk about that prescription. And again, philosophically, I strongly disagree with your premise. The prescription that we bring to any international engagement, we are looking at trying to help the African continent develop its democratic principles, develop good governance. Now, if one were to suggest that that somehow shapes and directs the future of the continent, all one can say what that does is it participates with the African Union in the development of its own thrust toward democratic governance and good governance. If you look at the premise of the African Union says it wants a strong continent that is a peaceful continent and that is a prosperous continent. The continent can become more prosperous and more peaceful with the kind of assistance that is given from nations like the U.S. and other nations around the world. China has done a phenomenally wonderful job on the continent in terms of developing a lot of infrastructure projects. And we applaud what the Chinese are doing. We're not competitive with the Chinese in terms of the Chinese effort to develop the continent. We think that what the Chinese are doing in terms of infrastructure projects and what we're doing in terms of trying to make a more substantially strong, prosperous, independent African continent is actually activity of complementarity. It is not activity of conflict, nor is it activity of competition. It is activity of complementarity. And we will continue that process. And we think we have a lot to offer to the African continent. The U.S. has never colonized any place on the African continent. We have the largest Africa diaspora of any other nation on the face of the earth. We have a much more strong Afrocentricity in the development of what happens in our cities and in our states in the U.S. So there is a natural affinity that the U.S. has with the African continent, and there's a strategic advantage.
But you don't have a good track record. Although U.S. didn't colonize any single African nation, the U.S. does not have a good track record in terms of aligning itself with African dictators. You've seen of Mobutu, way back in the 60s.
Well, now,
and you know, that doesn't give the whole picture.
Now, the U.S. has a very good track record on the African continent. Now, if you were to premise that we don't have a good track record of working with dictators, I'm glad we don't have a good track record of working with dictators. We have an excellent track record, however, with working with the development on the continent. We spend more on African development in healthcare and education, in the mitigation of conflict, the mitigation of disease, the mitigation of difficulties than any other nation on the face of the earth. In fact, the only group that spends more on Africa than the U.S. is the European Union. But that's the collaborative of all of the nations on the European continent. Nobody has invested more in the development of Africa than the U.S. has. We have exceptional friendships with African nations individually. We have exceptional friendships with the regional organizations on the continent and with the African Union. Now, there are some instances that we may not be as welcome as we would like to be welcomed. I don't think we'll be as welcomed in Zimbabwe as we would like to be, but we have an embassy in Zimbabwe, even with some of the difficulties that we may have with the direction that individual African nations are going. So we are present. We have always been present in a substantive way, and will continue to be present in a substantive way.
I always said you're a welcome guest, not just as a person, but as a man who represents the United States. Basically, what I'm saying is the United States a welcome guest in Africa? You started the Combined Joint Task Force for the Horn of Africa way back in 2002. That came immediately after, in less than a year after the September the 11th terrorist attacks in New York City, in Washington D.C., and all that. You are motivated by your strategic interests, and that's what it says. You in the Combined Joint Task Force. You do. I know you've been into some development activities, trying to recreate the image of the United States in Africa. But basically, what drives you most is your strategic interests, and that's why you have that task force here in Djibouti.
There's no inconsistency whatsoever in having a strategic interest and having an interest that makes us a welcome guest. Your premise continues to be that the U.S. is not a welcome guest, and I continue to suggest to you that that is a false premise. So any conclusion drawn for it is going to have some difficulty with validity. It is clearly the case, from my perspective, and validated by the perspective of the nations with which we have phenomenal bilateral relationships, to include your own nation, that the U.S. is indeed not only a welcome guest on the continent, we are a welcome partner on the continent, and we are an engaging partner on the continent. That does not mean that we do not have strategic interest. We have a tremendous strategic interest on the Horn of Africa. Part of what